Saint Lucia, this emerald of the Caribbean, has carried us through silence, through scars, through voices muffled by chains. We have walked its fields together, stood in its courtrooms, and listened for the cries that were buried beneath ledgers and laws. And though this will not be the last time we speak of Saint Lucia, tonight marks our final chapter here for now. But endings are not silence, they are doorways. Every story we have carried has been more than history, it has been testimony. The men, women, and children whose names flicker only in registers and court records were creations of Allah, oppressed in His earth, and their voices are meant to echo through us. So let this farewell be a charge, that you, the listener, continue to speak their names, continue to share their truths, and let their cries ripple through generations. Because when you bear witness, you become part of the chain of remembrance. You become part of the evidence. And on the day of judgment, when the oppressors stand before Allah and claim ignorance, it will not only be the enslaved who rise as witnesses. It will be us as well, for we heard, we remembered, and we refused to let their stories die. This is not goodbye to Saint Lucia. It is a pause, a sacred marker in a journey we will return to. Until then, carry these stories in your chest as living proof, so that cruelty will never again hide in silence. With that being said, here is the final stories for Saint Lucia until we meet again. 1. Now picture the field stocks. Wooden beams bolted together with holes carved out just wide enough to lock ankles, wrists, or even necks. Once inside, the body is trapped in rigid stillness. The wood is rough, splintering skin with every small movement. The victim cannot walk, cannot lie comfortably, cannot defend themselves from the heat, the insects, or the stares of passers-by. Hours stretch into nights. The muscles stiffen. The mind drifts into despair. Sir John Jeremie himself admitted he had helped draft laws that allowed these devices, only later confessing his horror at what they inflicted. But for the enslaved, the field stocks were not policy or regulation. They were daily nightmares. Men and women sat locked in them under the sun and the rain, with nothing but their eyes to plead for compassion. Those eyes were serious, desperate, searching for even the smallest crack of humanity in the hearts of their oppressors. But too often they found nothing. The restraint was not only wooden, it was emotional, spiritual, and deliberate. It was meant to reduce a living soul into a spectacle of power. 2. Before we begin this part, I want to give you words to carry in your mind, body, and soul. These are words you'll hear throughout this series. Not just vocabulary, but keys to understanding the world our ancestors were forced into. Let these words settle in you, because they will shape the way we walk through their story together. Hierarchy. A hierarchy is a system where people are ranked one above the other, like steps on a ladder. In slavery, this meant white masters at the top, then free coloreds, house slaves, and field slaves at the very bottom. It's a way of saying some lives matter more than others. Proximity. Proximity means closeness. In slavery, house slaves had proximity to the master. They were physically closer, working inside the house instead of outside in the fields. That closeness gave them small privileges, but also meant being closer to the cruelty and control of the master himself. Calluses. Calluses are thick, rough patches of skin that form on your hands or feet after long, hard labor. For the enslaved in the fields, calluses were living proof of endless work. Cutting cane, carrying loads, digging soil until the skin hardened. Calluses tell the story of suffering written on the body itself. Bureaucratic. Bureaucratic means something that belongs to the world of official records, laws, and paperwork. Governments and systems writing rules and keeping files. For slaves, the bureaucratic side of slavery was the ledgers, censuses, and registers that reduced people to numbers, origins, and owners. It's the cold paperwork of oppression. Systems. A system is a structure, rules, habits, and powers all working together. Slavery was not just individual cruelty, it was a system. It involved the economy, the church, the government, the law, and the plantation, all connected, all reinforcing each other to keep people enslaved. 3. In Saint Lucia, free coloreds, mulattoes, were people of mixed black and white heritage, usually born from white masters exploiting enslaved black women. Behind that word mulatto is betrayal, a child born of violence, of a master's abuse against a woman who could not say no. The white man's sin became the black woman's burden. And yet, when the child arrived, society gave it a different name, a different place, as if that blood diluted the chains. Imagine the cruelty of a mother, forced to watch her child be recognized, not because she gave birth in pain, but because a white man planted his seed through domination. The very existence of these children was proof of exploitation, yet they were labeled as if it were honor. This is not just history, it's an open wound. These free mixed-race individuals were given certain rights and privileges because of their bloodline, separating them from field slaves. Here lies the betrayal of division. The oppressor used blood as a weapon to fracture the enslaved. By giving a few privileges to the mixed, they created a false ladder, a hierarchy where some looked slightly higher, while all were still chained to the same plantation economy. Imagine the bitterness of siblings. One with darker skin sent to the field, the other with lighter skin allowed small comforts, both born of the same mother's suffering. It was a game of cruelty, teaching one to look down while still being trampled. Privilege was not freedom. It was another form of control. Many were designated as house slaves, with more privileges than those who worked in the fields. To be chosen for the house was often seen as a step above, food scraps instead of hunger, softer hands instead of calluses. But it came at a cost. The house slave lived closer to the master, closer to his demands, closer to the daily humiliation of serving at his table, watching him eat in plenty while their own people starved outside. The division created envy and shame. Field workers looked at the house as betrayal, and house workers lived with guilt, knowing their small advantage came from proximity to the very people who brutalized them. It was survival, not honor. Census and hierarchy. Records like the 1790 census of Saint Lucia even tracked this divide, showing the layers of hierarchy created by race and bloodline. The cruelty of paper. Imagine a census, a book of names, numbers, and categories. Each line was a judgment: black, mulatto, white. Human lives flattened into categories of worth. The census was not neutral. It was a ledger of hierarchy, a bureaucratic tool to remind every person of their place in the system. Even mixed children, born from the violence of their mothers, were written down as separate from the Africans they came from. That's how deep the betrayal ran. Ink itself was used to divide a people, to teach them that their bloodline determined their destiny. 4. In 1826, when the world was already whispering about abolition, a new law was announced in Saint Lucia. To the enslaved, these laws always felt distant, written in foreign tongues, drafted in chambers they would never enter. What mattered wasn't the ink, but the whip, the chain, the hunger. And almost immediately, one case cut through the silence to reveal just how hollow those laws were. An enslaved man walked into court not in dignity, but in iron. Around his neck was a collar so tight it was riveted shut, impossible to remove. From it protruded 3 heavy spikes, 10 inches long, cruelly designed to jab, to catch, to mark him out as less than human. Each movement of his body reminded him of the iron pressed against his skin, a constant humiliation dragged into public view. The collar wasn't only on his neck. From it ran chains, biting into his ankles, binding his steps. Smaller spikes cut into his skin whenever he shifted. Imagine the exhaustion of laboring in the fields like that, every bend of the back, every stride pulling against steel. He carried not only cane stalks, but the mockery of chains designed to say, "You do not own your body. We own even the air around it." He testified that he wore this collar day and night for months. No relief, no reprieve. By day he cut cane and carried loads under the sun. By night he tried to lie down in a cell with iron teeth digging into his neck. Sleep must have felt like drowning. Rest was impossible. His body was alive, but it was a body in constant torment. His only crime, wanting to run, to be free. The collar was meant to stop him from escaping, but more than that, it was a message. It told others what happened to those who dared to dream of freedom. It was psychological warfare as much as physical torture. It was a warning nailed to his very skin. If you try to leave, this will be you. The case was so shocking that a commission of 3 colonial officials was sent to investigate. They came with titles of humanity and protector of slaves, men who claimed to represent justice. But to the enslaved, they were just another extension of the system, a system where every verdict bent toward the planter's comfort. The commissioners admitted it wasn't just one man. On the same estate, they found 3 other men wearing collars of the exact same design. This was no solitary cruelty. It was a practice, a routine, a policy of terror. 4 men, standing as evidence that iron was more trusted than compassion. Then came the most chilling discovery. A woman, covered in sores, who had been chained for nearly 2 years. Imagine her skin, rubbed raw until wounds opened. Imagine the infection, the flies, the pain of sitting, standing, sleeping while metal cut her flesh. 2 years of silence, of waiting for mercy that never came. Her body became a living testimony, but no one wrote her words. Only the sores spoke for her. And yet, when the commissioners wrote their report, not a single word of the enslaved people's testimony was included. Their voices were erased, as if they had never spoken. The men and the woman were turned into objects of inspection, not humans crying out for justice. The commissioners even admitted the collars were heavy, but excused it by weighing one and declaring it not heavier than usual. Their logic was absurd, a cruelty wrapped in polite language. They admitted the chains existed, admitted the sores, admitted the torment, and then shrugged it off with a sentence. To them, the problem was not the suffering, but the possibility of rebellion. In the end, the officials concluded that the estate was well managed and the arrangements were good. They praised the order of the plantation while ignoring the pain of the people who built it. The reputation of the planter was worth more than the life of a man in a collar or a woman chained for years. This was not just a story of iron collars and chains. It was a story of voices silenced, evidence dismissed, and justice twisted to protect power. The cruelty was admitted and still excused. 5. The strong man unknown. But today we will hear him. One enslaved person stood in that courtroom and dared to speak truth to power. Since you are a judge, you could easily find cases of cruelty to prosecute. You could have taken any planter, even yourself, if you placed your hand on your conscience. In that moment, Allah was showing the judges their own hypocrisy, reflecting their guilt back to them through the very voices they tried to silence. Yet their hearts were blind. They could not see that every lash, every chain, every body broken on the plantation was evidence already written against them. Their robes could not cover their sins. Their titles could not shield them from the justice of Allah. What they dismissed in arrogance that day will rise against them on the day of judgment, when no excuse and no disguise will remain. This was how the system protected itself. The judge pretended his hands were tied, hiding behind legal procedure, claiming he could do nothing without a public prosecutor. But in truth, this was a deliberate shield. It created a loophole where cruelty could thrive unchecked. Enslaved people had no way to bring charges, no voice in the law, and those who might have spoken on their behalf risked losing everything. So the system became a circle of silence. The planter inflicted violence, the enslaved endured it, and the courts looked away. Murder could be carried out in broad daylight, but unless someone with power chose to speak, it was as if it had never happened. This was not justice. It was bureaucracy dressed up as fairness, designed to excuse crimes rather than confront them. 6. In 1815, a case came before the court that stripped away any illusion of fairness. It was not a case of property or debt between planters, but the fate of a mother and her son. The boy was only 15 years old, barely a man, still a child. Yet the court saw him not as a youth with a future, but as value belonging to his master. His crime was simple. He tried to escape. In the twisted logic of the system, that meant he was robbing his master of property, because his body, his strength, his very life were considered nothing more than a financial asset. But behind that act was something greater. This boy had grown up under cruelty, born into chains, raised in a world where whips cracked louder than lullabies. And yet, courage burned within his soul. He longed for a life beyond the cane fields, beyond the overseer's glare, beyond the endless days of labor. When he tried to escape, it wasn't just a flight from one plantation to another. It was a cry from within. I was made for more than this. He dreamt of freedom, of walking without fear, of breathing air that was not claimed by an owner's will. Every step he took toward escape was more than movement. It was the sound of his soul refusing chains. He risked everything because the idea of freedom, however distant, was worth more than the certainty of bondage. For a moment, he believed in a future where his body belonged to him, not to an owner's ledger. And that courage, the courage to dream, to move his feet toward the possibility of freedom, terrified the system more than rebellion itself. Because if one boy could imagine himself free, then every enslaved soul could follow. His act of escape was not just about himself, it was about hope. And still, the court twisted his courage into a crime. His dream of freedom was reduced to theft, as though by fleeing he had robbed his master of property. In the eyes of the court, his escape was not courage, it was theft. They declared that he had robbed his master, as though his very body belonged to someone else. His so-called crime was that he tried to steal himself, to take back what was always his own life, his own freedom. To men whose hearts were blind, his soul's cry meant nothing. They could not see his humanity. They only saw lost dollars. The boy who wanted nothing more than to live free was treated as a criminal for daring to believe he was more than a line in someone's ledger. Beside him stood his mother. Her only crime was pity, but really it was love. This was the woman who had once labored in pain to bring him into the world, who held him close and whispered lullabies to soothe his cries in the night. She had watched him take his first trembling steps, kiss the scrapes on his knees, and marveled as he grew from boy to young man. Every inch of his body, every flicker of his soul, she cherished as God's gift to her in a cruel world. She was his shelter, his comfort, his anchor. And for this, the court condemned her. In a world turned upside down, a mother's compassion was treated not as virtue but as rebellion. The men in robes looked at her kindness and called it criminal, as though mercy itself was a threat to the order of slavery. The judgment was cruel beyond words. The boy was sentenced to be hanged. From the moment the sentence was spoken, the boy must have felt the world collapse around him. Death itself is heavy for a child of 15, but the cruelest blow was knowing his mother would be forced to watch. All he had wanted was freedom, just a taste of life without chains. Yet now, because he dared to dream, his mother's heart was sentenced to break in public. As he was led to the gallows, every step must have felt like a betrayal he never meant to give. He was her child, her joy, her answered prayer. And now, his last gift to her would be grief. The oppressors twisted his courage into cruelty, turning his love for freedom into a dagger against his own mother's soul. And when the rope was placed around his neck, what must have torn him apart was not the fear of death, but the sight of her tears. His last vision on this earth was the pain etched into her face, pain he never wanted to cause. That was the oppressor's design, to make a boy believe his own freedom was the weapon that destroyed the one he loved most. And his mother, punished not only with chains but with anguish, was sentenced to witness it. She would be forced to stand and watch the child she birthed in pain, the child she nursed and sang to, the child who carried her prayers in his footsteps, strangled before her eyes. Her grief was turned into a spectacle, her love weaponized against her. And when her son's body fell still, she was not released to mourn him. She was thrown into prison indefinitely, as if compassion itself were a crime. This was not justice. It was tyranny, the same cruelty that has echoed through time. Just as Pharaoh once ordered the killing of the Israelite children, simply because their parents would not call him God, so too did the Europeans carry that same tyranny in their blood. They feared the power of hope, the strength of mercy, and the courage of the oppressed. And like Pharaoh, they tried to crush it by murdering sons before their mothers' eyes. Allah says in the Quran, "Indeed, Pharaoh exalted himself in the land and divided its people into factions, oppressing a group among them, slaughtering their sons and keeping their women alive. Indeed, he was of the corrupters." Surah Al-Qasas 28:4. The story of Pharaoh is not distant. It is mirrored in the islands of the Caribbean, where mothers like this one bore witness to the same arrogance, the same blood-stained hands, the same war against God's truth. And what makes this even heavier is that it wasn't just a passing cruelty, forgotten in the winds of time. This judgment was formally recorded, stamped into government records, and later confirmed in France. It stood as lawful, upheld by a nation that prided itself on civilization. It was never overturned, never apologized for, never undone. On paper, this was justice. In truth, it was tyranny dressed in law. The fact that this judgment stood, confirmed in official French records and never overturned, tells us everything about the world the enslaved lived in. It showed that the system was never about justice. It was about control. Love was criminalized, compassion was punished, and freedom itself was treated as theft. A boy's courage to dream was twisted into a crime, and a mother's mercy was turned into her chains. And because the court wrote it down and called it lawful, the oppressors left behind their own testimony. They thought they were preserving order, but what they really preserved was evidence, proof of their arrogance, proof of their tyranny, proof of their blindness to the humanity of those they crushed. They may have escaped the reach of human justice, but they cannot escape a law. Every word they wrote, every sentence they passed, will rise as evidence against them when the true judge calls all accounts to light. As Allah says, "And the record of deeds will be placed open, and you will see the criminals fearful of what is within it. And they will say, 'Oh, woe to us! What is this book that leaves nothing small or great except that it has enumerated it?' And they will find what they did present before them. And your Lord does injustice to no one." Surah Al-Kahf 1849. At first, I wasn't sure I should even stay in St. El. I felt like there was nothing there for me to write about. No first-hand diary, no direct witness that could guide me through that city's silence. Part of me wanted to move on, back to Africa, to find a story I could anchor myself in. But then I went back and opened The History of Slavery in St. Lou by Jeremy Bentham, and it was as though Allah Himself laid my eyes on the souls who needed to be remembered, not in their own voices, because their voices were stolen, but through fragments, through shadows, through the words of others who saw what happened. Even if the listener is not a witness to what happened, the heart knows when it's touching something real. And what I realized is that these people, perhaps they were Muslims, perhaps their faith was stripped with their names, but they were still our people. They carried our struggle, and their suffering is tied to ours. I love Black people in the deepest way. One Black man's struggle is every Black man's struggle. That's something Allah teaches us, to feel the wound of another as if it's our own, to hurt when humanity is hurt. Because when one is chained, we are all chained. And when one is freed, a door opens for all of us to walk through.